Good morning and welcome to another edition of the Daily Fix. I am your usual host and presenter, Advocate Tulo Hoyane. This morning, I would like to bring you the story of the arrest of Zamokuhle Mbatha. Zamokuhle Mbatha was the first person to be arrested in the Meyiwa investigation. The story comes straight from former investigator Constable Tapadima. Constable Tapadima says some 2 or 3 days after the killing of Meyiwa, they were dispatched to the Nongoma police station in KwaZulu-Natal. When they got there, Zamokuhle Mbatha was already arrested. And he says the sole reason why Zamokuhle Mbatha was then arrested and brought by this team of investigators to Johannesburg or Gauteng was because the team had been fed a narrative. Zamokuhle Mbatha had dreadlocks and also happened to know the Vosloorus area. So, according to Constable Tapadima, those who had come up with the narrative of 636, that there had been intruders into that house, were just looking for somebody who would fit the description of that narrative. In other words, Zamokuhle Mbatha was arrested simply because he fitted that narrative. He had the dreadlocks and knew the Vosloorus area. So it was then that Zamokuhle Mbatha was brought by this team of investigators to Gauteng. After an intensive interrogation, I'm told by former Constable Tapadima, it was established that Zamokuhle Mbatha had nothing to do with the killing of Meyiwa. Constable Tapadima also drew my attention to the fact that there was a cell phone. There was evidence in court of a cell phone belonging to Kelly Khumalo that had been robbed from Kelly Khumalo when the intruders burst into that house. And it was also publicized that these people would be tracked through that cell phone which they had robbed from Kelly Khumalo in the house. When they interrogated Zamokuhle Mbatha and crime intelligence did its part, there was no cell phone, let alone any connection, being made to the cell phone to Zamokuhle Mbatha. That cell phone, which was allegedly robbed from Kelly Khumalo, has never been found. So, former Constable Tapadima says it was at this stage when it became very clear that the intruder story was simply a red herring. It was a story simply concocted to protect the real killer of Meyiwa. Let me go ahead and also say, after the description of the dreadlocked man was given, there was a nationwide manhunt for the killer of Senzo Meyiwa. And after the wrongful arrest, should I say, of Zamokuhle Mbatha, there was widespread publicity that at last the case had been solved. Zamokuhle Mbatha was then brought to court on charges that he was Senzo Meyiwa's killer. That case simply collapsed. It collapsed and Zamokuhle Mbatha was eventually released. The main reason why it collapsed was because it was an unlawful arrest. There was simply no basis, or there was simply no concrete reasons why Zamokuhle Mbatha had been arrested, except that Zamokuhle Mbatha fitted the narrative that one of the intruders had dreadlocks. That was the sole reason why Zamokuhle Mbatha was arrested, humiliated, and his name carried all over the media. So that is the story of Zamokuhle Mbatha. When the matter came to court, the case was simply struck off the road. There was not an iota of evidence that in any way linked Zamokuhle Mbatha to the killing of Senzo Meyiwa. But the trauma that the man had gone through, the stigmatization that he had gone through, followed him and continues to follow him to this day. So the malicious, the unlawful arrest and malicious prosecution just manifested itself in court when the case collapsed. Thereafter, Zamokuhle Mbatha sued the Minister of Police for wrongful arrest and malicious prosecution, and is suing the South African government for millions of rands. I still have to make a follow-up to that case and see where it ended. But Zamokuhle Mbatha then instituted those legal proceedings because, as a matter of fact, his arrest had been wrongful and that his prosecution had been malicious. These are the facts as narrated and analyzed to me by former Constable Tapadim. So the Senzo Meyiwa investigation has been, from the very beginning, something of a witch hunt. A narrative was first of all, generated. Once that narrative had been generated, the task then was to fit anybody, or to connect anybody, or to look for anybody that would fit that narrative. We are now seeing 5 accused persons in that dock. At the time that Zamokuhle Mbatha was arrested, none of these people had been arrested. It was only after the release of Zamokuhle Mbatha, after his case collapsed in court, that we started hearing about the arrest of the suspects that we see before the Pretoria High Court. And that came 6 years later, in 2020. People that we see in court now were only arrested 6 years after the murder of Senzo Meyiwa. Most probably because they also feed that narrative that they were intruders into that house. So it is a question of fitting individuals into whatever narratives people spin. So these are not the first suspects that we are seeing here. We have already seen an unlawful arrest and malicious prosecution take place of Zamokuhle Mbatha. And these accused persons before the Pretoria High Court have always said and continue to say that they have nothing to do with the killing of Senzo Meyiwa. Former Constable Tapadima also told me that it was following the arrest of Zamokuhle Mbatha and his eventual release by the courts that it became clear, it became abundantly clear that the narrative of 636 was simply designed and came into being to throw investigators off the trail of the real killer of Senzo Meyiwa. So this is the situation that you must put into perspective as we look deeper and deeper into the Senzo Meyiwa trial. The story of Zamokuhle Mbatha. And the story of Zamokuhle Mbatha is a typical one in the South African police services. Because in the last year or so, the Minister of Police has had to pay millions of rands. I think the figure could even come up to something like 2 billion for malicious, for unlawful arrests and malicious prosecutions. What we have before the Pretoria High Court, the narrative of 375 tells us that before the Pretoria High Court, we are seeing an unlawful arrest and a malicious prosecution. Because 375 clearly is the more credible of the two versions and says there were no intruders into that house. You know, if Gininda can do it once with Zamokuhle Mbatha, why not the second time? Remember how widely publicized that the case had been broken or solved with the arrest of Zamokuhle Mbatha. The outcome? Zamokuhle Mbatha is a free man today. This is the Senzo Meyiwa trial, I always say. Fraught with shocks right that run right through. Having said that, let me bring this episode to an end by saying thank you very much for watching. I also want to thank you in a special way for the subscriptions that I'm seeing. Please like this video, share this video, and don't skip those ads. Thank you very much and have a nice